Good afternoon. I am Jeremy Travis, president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm honored to be hosting today's American Justice Summit with Tina Brown and the other co-hosts. I and we are here today for 2.3 million people who are behind bars. I also stand before you today as the chair of a committee of scholars, which was asked by the National Academy of Sciences to address two profound questions. First, how did we get to this point? How did we become the world's largest jailer? And second, what are the consequences for our society of having 1 in 100 American adults behind bars? The first step is to recognize that it has not always been so. If we go back in our history, before we even knew the phrase mass incarceration, we had a very low rate of imprisonment. Between 1920 and the early 1970s, our incarceration rate was stable at about 110 per 100,000. During these 50 years, America went through some hard times and some good times, through war and peace, through the Great Depression, times of economic growth, great influx of immigrants, times of enormous social change, and yet through all this, the prison rate in America remained steady. In 1972, we started on a different course. We started to increase the number of people we sent to prison, and we continued to increase our incarceration rate every year for the next 40 years. So that by 2009, we had quadrupled the rate of incarceration in our country, and we had increased sevenfold the number of people behind bars. Now we say we live in an era of mass incarceration. This new reality is not only aberrational in terms of our own history, but it is internationally unique. Compared to every other Western democracy, our rate of incarceration is 5 to 10 times higher. No other country, no other democracy responds to crime by putting so many of its own citizens behind bars. So how did this happen? The answer is, frankly, brutally, we chose to be here. This, I think, is the most bracing conclusion of the National Academy of Sciences report. Our high incarceration rates reflect choices that we made in our democracy. So what does this say about our political history over the last 4 decades? The report is also clear on this point. We elected political candidates for office who promised to be tough on crime, and they delivered. We made, through our legislative and executive and judicial branches, we made long sentences longer. We adopted phrases that had meaning like truth in sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, life without parole. And at the same time, through mandatory minimums, we placed people in prison who could have been better sanctioned in the community. And at the same time, we launched a war on drugs that used the heavy hammer of prison in ways that no other democracy has. So these are all choices that we made. Political choices that have set us apart from other countries. So as a result of these choices, the rate of incarceration for all crimes has increased by 4-fold. Some doubled, some tripled, some 4-fold. But the greatest increase has been for drug crimes. And there, the incarceration rate has increased 10-fold. So all of these increases have significant consequences for our democracy, for our society, for our labor markets, and in particular, for communities of color. So 90% of the people in prison are men. Over half are Black or Hispanic. They come predominantly from communities of color. And one of the findings of our report, very troubling, is that almost all of the growth came from high school dropouts. So just consider what I consider to be a jaw-dropping statistic in the National Academy report. Today, standing here today, the chances that a male African-American high school dropout will spend at least a year in prison before his mid-30s is 68%. A generation ago, before the prison buildup started, before the 70s, that same individual, an African-American male high school dropout, had a 15% chance over his lifetime of serving at least a year in prison. What have we done to our country? What have we done for our aspirations for racial justice? What have we done for those who are struggling on the margins of our society? This is not because the rates of crime in that community are higher. We have the lowest crime in a generation. This is because we've chosen to be here. So just to be clear, the National Academy report also found that one thing that did not bring us to the era of mass incarceration is our crime rate. During the 40 years of steady growth of incarceration, the crime rate has gone up and gone down. Once again, the report was clear. The crime increases in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s changed the politics of crime. But it's not the crime rates themselves that have caused the increase in incarceration. So some would say, what about the crime decline? Do we have a safer society, one might ask, today because we have so many people in prison? A reasonable question. Again, the National Academy report is illuminating. According to the research that we summarized, the twin drivers of high incarceration rates, making already long sentences longer and putting people in prison who otherwise could have been sanctioned in the community, the very strong research findings is that those two sentencing changes have very little public safety benefit. At the same time, the enormous increase of people in prison for drug crimes has had very little effect on the use of crime and the price of, the use of drugs and the price of drugs. So today, as we sit here at this summit, we face twin realities that have brought us together. On the one hand, we have the lowest crime rates in a generation, and we celebrate this fact as we should. This is something that was not imaginable 20 years ago, 25 years ago, at the height of the crack epidemic. And at the same time, the second reality is that we have the world's highest incarceration rates. Yet, and most important, what we know is that these two realities are not causally linked. Stated differently, we know today that we can cut our prison rates dramatically without jeopardizing public safety. And we see all around us examples of states that are doing exactly that. So, as a society, we need to ask some very, very tough questions. We have to choose to exit the reality where we find ourselves, the era of mass incarceration, by reverting to the democratic processes that got us here. Just to be clear, we can't bring incarceration rates down much by bringing crime rates down, as important as that is. Instead, we need a new political reality. If our democracy got us into this fix, our democracy has to get us out. So what do we need? And what are we committed to today, and what do we hope you sign on to? We need brave governors. We need brave legislators. We need brave judges. More importantly, we need a public that demands that our elected officials do what needs to be done because they're not always inclined to be brave. So what needs to be done? The agenda is quite clear. Long sentences need to be shorter. We don't need, as we now have, nursing homes behind bars. We don't need, as we now have, geriatric prisons. We don't need inmates so old and infirm that they can't remember the crime that they committed when they come before a parole board. We don't need inmates on dialysis machines. We need to punish according to the severity of the crime and not in excess. We need parsimony in our punishment. Second, we need to be more imaginative in dealing with low-level offenses and not rely on the mandatory sentences that have been the second big contributor to mass incarceration. Those individuals need to be sanctioned in communities. People with mental illness, addiction problems, need not be in prison. We need to use our ingenuity, the American ingenuity, to find other ways to address their problems and to respond to the crimes that they commit. And third, we need to rethink the war on drugs. No other country has done what we have done, and we need to dial it back. We need to think about new ways to respond to drug use as a health and a mental health issue, and we need to think about new ways to work with communities to provide safety if those communities are overrun with drug dealers. We need prison less and creativity more. So the bottom line, it's simple, and that's why we're here, but it'll take a long time. The bottom line is we need a national movement to cut the prison population at least in half. We know that we can do it. It may take years, but the time to get started is now. Thank you for coming.